It's as American as apple pie.
340 horse, 4-speed.
Oh, it looks like it's been sitting for a while. Look at all the mold. It's been repainted, obviously. Whoever restored it painted, but this might be the original color.
It's the original color, I know that for sure.
There it is.
Some garages are just storage. Frank Fritz's garage was something closer to a memory box. Every shelf, every dusty case, every leaning motorcycle frame telling a piece of a story most people never got to hear in full. For over a decade, television audiences watched Frank Fritz hunt for other people's forgotten treasures on the History Channel's American Pickers. What fewer people ever saw was his own collection, the one he built quietly for himself long before the cameras ever rolled and long after they stopped. When Frank passed away in the fall of 2024, that private world finally came into focus, and what it revealed said as much about the man as anything he ever said on camera. This is the real story of what was actually inside Frank Fritz's garage. No invented mystery cars, no anonymous whistleblowers, no secret brass plates. Just the truth about a man who spent his whole life collecting pieces of the past, and what that collection tells us about who he really was. Frank Lee Fritz was born on October 11, 1963, in Davenport, Iowa, and the instinct that would define his entire life showed up almost as soon as he could walk. As a boy attending Sudlow Intermediate School, Frank discovered the simple thrill of collecting. Postage stamps, rocks, old beer cans, anything with a story attached to it. He would walk the train tracks near his home toward the village of East Davenport, scanning the ground for whatever had been tossed from passing freight cars, treating a rusted can or a bent piece of metal like a small archaeological find. That habit never left him. By the time he reached his teenage years, Frank had shifted his attention to motorcycles, a passion that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He worked odd jobs at Quad City Automatic Sprinkler, at Coast to Coast Hardware, just to save enough money to buy his first real bike, a brand new Harley-Davidson that cost him $4,100, a price so steep his parents were stunned when he told them. For a teenager in Iowa in the late 1970s, that kind of purchase wasn't just a milestone. It was a statement about what mattered to him. It was around this time that Frank crossed paths with a classmate named Mike Wolf, first at Sudlow Intermediate and later at Bettendorf High School, where Frank graduated in 1982. The two boys shared something rare, an obsession with old things nobody else seemed to want. Wolf was already picking through barns and back roads looking for forgotten Americana, and Frank, with his eye for motorcycles and his patience for sorting through junk, fit right alongside him. Neither of them knew yet that this shared hobby would eventually become a television phenomenon. Frank's home life growing up wasn't always easy. His father left the family early on, and his mother, Susan, eventually remarried a tire salesman named Richard Zerbs, who helped raise Frank alongside her. Money was tight in the household, which may be part of why Frank's early collecting habits leaned so heavily on things that cost nothing but effort. A stamp here, a rock there, a rusted can pulled from the weeds beside the railroad tracks. Long before he ever thought about turning it into a living, collecting was simply Frank's way of finding value in things other people had already decided weren't worth keeping. That worldview only deepened as he got older. By the time he was buying his first Harley-Davidson as a teenager, Frank had already developed the instinct that would define his entire adult life. Patience paired with genuine curiosity. He wasn't just accumulating objects. He wanted to understand them, how they were made, who might have owned them, and why they'd ended up forgotten in the first place. That habit of asking questions about ordinary objects would eventually become the foundation of his entire career. Despite his early love for collecting, Frank didn't turn it into a career right away. For nearly 25 years, he worked as a fire and safety inspector across a stretch of Iowa that ran from Des Moines to Cedar Falls, a steady, unglamorous job that had nothing to do with vintage motorcycles or antique signs. But the itch never went away. On weekends and days off, Frank kept doing what he'd always done, digging through barns, garages, and junkyards, buying what caught his eye, and slowly building both a personal collection and a small resale business. Eventually, that side hustle became real enough that Frank opened his own shop, first in Savannah, Illinois, where he sold the vintage motorcycles, toys, and oddities he'd been accumulating for years. It was a modest operation, built one purchase at a time, but it gave Frank something the fire inspector job never could, a way to spend his days fully immersed in the thing he loved most. It's worth pausing on just how long Frank kept both lives running side by side. Nearly a quarter century as a fire and safety inspector is a long time to hold down a steady, structured job while quietly building an entirely different identity on the side. He wasn't a hobbyist dabbling on weekends for a year or two before making a leap of faith. He spent decades proving to himself, through countless weekend trips and small transactions, that his eye for value was reliable before he ever risked walking away from a secure paycheck. That patience says something about Frank's character that often gets lost in the shorthand version of his story, the idea that he simply stumbled into fame. In reality, by the time American pickers came calling, Frank had already put in the work of a genuine expert, just without an audience watching. In 2010, that quiet hobby turned into something enormous. Frank reunited with his old friend Mike Wolfe to co-host a new History Channel series called American Pickers, which followed the two men as they crisscrossed the country searching for valuable antiques hidden in barns, garages, and private collections. The premise was simple, but the chemistry between Frank and Mike, one driven and business-minded, the other laid-back and easygoing, turned out to be television gold. The very first episode pulled in more than 3 million viewers, a debut so strong it set a new record for the network. Frank quickly became known as the Smalls guy, the one with an eye for compact, easily overlooked items. Old toys, advertising signs, oil cans, and above all, vintage motorcycles. His deep, almost encyclopedic knowledge of old bikes, especially rare panhead Harleys, became one of the show's recurring highlights. Whether he was talking a stranger down on the price of a decades-old motorcycle frame or explaining the history behind a forgotten toy, Frank's expertise was never performative. It came from a lifetime of actually doing the work. That knowledge eventually led him to publish his own guide, How to Pick Vintage Motorcycles, which walked readers through finding, negotiating for, and maintaining old bikes, along with a section on vintage toy motorcycles pulled straight from his personal collection. He also contributed to American Picker's Guide to Picking alongside Mike Wolfe, Danielle Colby, and Libby Calloway, cementing his reputation as more than just a television personality. He was, by then, a genuine authority in the world of vintage collecting. The show itself became a genuine cultural phenomenon, and it's easy to forget just how unusual that was for a program built entirely around watching two guys knock on strangers' doors and dig through their sheds. Part of what made it work was the contrast between Frank and Mike. Wolfe was the driven half of the duo, always chasing the next lead, the next barn, the next big score. Frank brought something different, an even-keeled, unhurried presence that made every negotiation feel less like a business transaction and more like two people swapping stories about objects they both happened to love. Audiences responded to that authenticity. Frank wasn't performing enthusiasm for the camera. He was just being the same person he'd always been, the same kid who used to walk the railroad tracks looking for something interesting. Danielle Colby, who ran the antique archaeology office back in LeClaire while Frank and Mike were on the road, once noted that one of the more understated things about Frank was how devoted he was to his mother, comparing it to the closeness Elvis Presley was famously known for with his own mom. It's a small detail, but it fits the larger picture that friends and colleagues painted of him. Beneath the beard and the easy humor was someone who valued loyalty and long-term relationships, whether those relationships were with people or with the old objects he spent his life trying to save. So what did Frank Fritz really collect away from the cameras? The honest answer is less about hidden supercars and more about a lifetime spent gathering the things that fascinated him personally. Friends and colleagues have described a barn and workshop filled with vintage motorcycles, bikes in various states of restoration, some pristine, some still waiting for Frank's attention. Alongside them sat stacks of old toys, particularly toy motorcycles, and no shortage of vintage advertising signs and oil cans, the kind of small, colorful relics that first hooked him as a kid walking the railroad tracks. Frank's business, which eventually operated under the name Frank Fritz Finds in Savannah, Illinois, gave him a place to buy, sell, and display pieces from that world. It wasn't a museum with velvet ropes or curated lighting. It was a working space, filled with the tools, grease, and clutter that come from genuinely using and restoring old machines rather than simply displaying them behind glass. That distinction mattered to Frank. He wasn't chasing trophies to show off. He was chasing objects that had a history worth preserving, whether or not anyone else ever noticed them. Those who knew him well often pointed out that Frank's love for old things wasn't about profit margins, even though picking was, by definition, a business. One friend, reflecting on Frank's approach to the hobby, compared the joy of walking into somebody's garage or an antique store to the thrill of an Easter egg hunt. The pleasure was in the search itself, not just in what it might be worth afterward. That description captures something real about Frank. The actual value of an item, to him, was tied up in the story behind it, not just the number it might fetch at auction. Frank's specific fascination with panhead Harley-Davidsons deserves its own mention, because it wasn't a passing interest. It was closer to a specialty within a specialty. Panheads, produced by Harley-Davidson primarily through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, are prized by collectors for their distinctive rocker box covers and their place in motorcycle history as a transitional design between earlier and later engine technology. Frank's ability to identify, date, and evaluate these bikes at a glance became one of his signature contributions to American pickers, and it reflected years of hands-on study that long predated the show. He didn't learn to talk about panheads for television. He learned because he genuinely wanted to understand every bike he came across, down to the smallest design detail. Beyond the motorcycles, Frank's world was rounded out by the kind of everyday Americana that rarely gets its own spotlight. Old advertising signage with faded hand-painted lettering, oil cans from long-defunct petroleum brands, toy vehicles that had been played with, loved, and eventually forgotten in attics across the Midwest. None of it was flashy in the way a rare sports car might be, but collectively it painted a picture of a man who found meaning in the ordinary artifacts of American life just as much as in anything considered rare or valuable in a formal sense. Frank's time on American Pickers came to an end around 2020, when he stepped away from the show after appearing in it for more than a decade. The reasons behind his departure were, for a long time, the subject of public speculation, fueled in part by rumors of a falling out between Frank and Mike Wolfe. What is confirmed is that Frank's health had become a serious and growing concern. In 2022, he suffered a debilitating stroke that required hospitalization and a long period of therapy and rehabilitation. That stroke changed the course of Frank's life dramatically. He became far less visible publicly, and reports at the time indicated that Frank was later placed under a legal guardianship arrangement as his health and personal affairs became more difficult for him to manage on his own. It was a stark contrast to the version of Frank that audiences had grown used to seeing, the confident, wisecracking picker navigating barns and negotiating deals. Behind the scenes, he was fighting a much quieter, much harder battle. Even during this difficult period, though Frank's connection to his old friend Mike Wolfe endured, even if the relationship needed time and distance to heal. According to people close to both men, the tension between them eased in the year before Frank's death. Wolfe reportedly traveled to see Frank, and by all accounts, the visit was an emotional one. The two men were said to have reminisced about the early days of the show, including how nervous they'd both been ahead of an early national television appearance, and shared a moment that friends described as deeply emotional for both of them. It wasn't a made-for-TV reconciliation. It was two old friends, one of them gravely ill, finding their way back to each other. During those quieter years, Frank still made an effort to stay connected to the world of collecting whenever his health allowed it. His shop in Savannah continued operating under his name, run with the help of people he trusted, even as Frank himself became less able to be there in person. It's a detail that speaks to how central picking remained to his identity even after fame and health had both slipped away from him. The business wasn't just a source of income by that point. It was one of the last threads connecting him to the life he'd spent decades building. The friends who visited him during this period described a man who, even while physically diminished, hadn't lost the sharpness or the humor that had made him so beloved on screen. He still wanted to talk about old bikes. He still lit up at the mention of a good find. The stroke had taken a great deal from him, but it hadn't touched the part of Frank that had been fascinated by forgotten objects since he was a boy walking the tracks near East Davenport. Frank Fritz died on the evening of September 30th, 2024, in Davenport, Iowa, at the age of 60. According to a close family friend, he passed away peacefully, surrounded by people who cared about him, including Mike Wolfe, who had traveled from Tennessee to be by his side in his final days. His death certificate, later reported by entertainment outlets, listed the cause of death as complications from a stroke, specifically described as a late effect of a cerebral infarction resulting from cerebral vascular disease, with aortic stenosis and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease also listed as contributing factors. It was, in the end, the culmination of health problems that had been building since his 2022 stroke, made worse by conditions that had quietly worsened over the following 2 years. Frank had also lived for years with Crohn's disease, a chronic condition that added yet another layer of difficulty to his final years. Mike Wolfe announced Frank's passing publicly in an emotional post, describing his former co-star as a dreamer who was every bit as sensitive as he was funny, and noting that the man audiences saw on television was the same person he knew off camera. The History Channel and the production company behind American Pickers released their own statement, remembering Frank as the bearded charmer, whose decade of searching for vintage motorcycles and forgotten treasures had helped define the show for millions of viewers. Tributes poured in from friends, colleagues, and fans across the country. People who had known Frank personally, not just as a television character, spoke about his kindness and his genuine, unforced love for the hunt, the same joy he'd felt as a kid walking the railroad tracks in Davenport, still present decades later every time he stepped into somebody's garage. One longtime friend, Jerry Gendreau, remembered Frank as someone who'd had a natural charisma even before television found him, joking that Frank had always been something of a showman even in ordinary conversation. Gendreau's recollection of Frank's outlook on the hobby that defined his life, that walking into an antique store or somebody's garage felt like a treasure hunt every single time, became one of the more widely shared reflections in the days after his death, precisely because it captured something so many fans had already sensed watching him on screen for over a decade. In the days that followed, friends in the Davenport area also organized a motorcycle run in Frank's honor, a fitting tribute for a man whose lifelong love of old bikes had shaped so much of his identity. It wasn't a formal, corporate memorial. It was a kind of send-off that made sense for someone who'd spent his whole life more comfortable in a garage than in a spotlight. Friends riding the same kind of machines Frank had spent decades collecting, restoring, and talking about with anyone who'd listen. In the months following Frank's death, a wave of videos and articles began circulating online, claiming that investigators or state representatives had opened his private Iowa garage and discovered an unidentified, possibly experimental Corvette, a mysterious vehicle tied to secret General Motors racing history, complete with a cryptic handwritten note and an anonymous insider quote about hidden factory prototypes. Versions of this story have appeared nearly word for word across dozens of different YouTube channels, TikTok accounts, and low-quality news aggregator websites, each one presenting the same unverified details, as if they were newly uncovered facts. It's worth being direct about this. There is no credible news reporting, estate documentation, or automotive history source confirming that any such vehicle exists. No established outlet, automotive or otherwise, has verified a secret Grand Sport Corvette, a mysterious brass plate, or a bidding war between museums and private collectors over an unnamed car. These stories appear to be speculative, entertainment-driven content built around Frank's real death and real reputation as a collector, using invented details to manufacture mystery where none has actually been documented. It's a disservice to a man whose actual life and actual collection were interesting enough without embellishment. What Frank Fritz really left behind wasn't a secret prototype hidden under a tarp. It was decades of vintage motorcycles lovingly restored or waiting to be, a lifetime's worth of toys and advertising relics gathered one flea market and one barn at a time, and a small shop in Savannah, Illinois, that carried his name and his reputation. That's not a lesser story. In some ways, it's a more honest and more moving one, because it doesn't need a manufactured twist to matter. What made Frank Fritz's actual collection meaningful wasn't rarity or dollar value. It was consistency. From the boy walking the tracks near East Davenport to the man running Frank Fritz finds decades later, The through line never changed. He was drawn to objects other people had given up on, and he had both the patience and the knowledge to see what those objects had once meant and could mean again. That instinct, more than any single vehicle or artifact, was the real treasure inside his world. His years on American Pickers gave millions of viewers a window into that instinct, even if the show could only capture a fraction of what Frank had built privately over a lifetime. The vintage motorcycles he loved, especially the old panheads he could talk about for hours, represented not just mechanical object to him, but pieces of a much larger American story, one written in garages, junkyards, and back roads rather than showrooms and auction houses. Frank's decline in his final years was difficult and, at times, painful to watch from the outside. The stroke, the guardianship, the years spent largely out of public view. But the reconciliation with Mike Wolfe before his death, and the outpouring of genuine affection from friends and fans after it, suggested that the warmth people associated with Frank on screen wasn't a performance. It was who he actually was, right up until the end. There was no secret car waiting behind a tarp to explain who Frank Fritz really was. He'd already shown people that one dusty motorcycle, one forgotten toy, and one unglamorous barn at a time, for more than a decade on television, and for decades more before the cameras ever found him. That, in the end, is what was really inside Frank Fritz's garage, not a mystery, but a life spent refusing to let the past disappear. So when people ask what was hiding behind Frank Fritz's garage door, the honest answer is simple. Exactly what he always said it was. Old bikes, old toys, old signs, and a man who never stopped believing they were worth saving.